two neighbors, one shared border, and a war that neither of them will openly admit is happening. On the surface, Saudi Arabia and the UAE look like brothers. They share the same desert. They speak the same language. They pray in the same direction. For decades, the world looked at them and saw one unified Gulf bloc, two rich, powerful kingdoms moving together like a single fist. But underneath that image, something has been breaking apart for years. And in December 2025, that breaking point finally cracked open for the entire world to see, when Saudi warplanes dropped bombs on a port in southern Yemen, targeting ships that had come directly from the UAE. Saudi Arabia bombed an Emirati arms shipment, read that again, two supposed allies, two nations that went to war together, two governments that have sat side by side in every major regional summit for the last 20 years, and one of them just bombed the other's weapons. That moment did not come out of nowhere. It was the final explosion after years of pressure building underground. And to truly understand how two brothers reached the point of dropping bombs on each other's supply lines, you have to understand one thing above everything else: geography. Because this rivalry is not just about politics. It is not just about oil. It is not just about two powerful men with big egos. This rivalry is about land, water, ports, trade routes, and the question of who controls the map of the future Middle East. And that answer is written not in speeches or treaties. It is written in the dirt, in the sand, in the sea lanes, and in the blood-soaked ground of 5 different countries at once. Let us start at the center. The home arena. Saudi Arabia is the largest country in the Arab world. Its economy is projected to hit $1.25 trillion in 2025. It sits on some of the world's largest oil reserves. It is the keeper of Islam's 2 holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, the spiritual coordinates of the entire Muslim world. When the world thinks of Arab power, it has always for a century thought of Riyadh first. The Saudis were the anchor of the Gulf, the anchor of the Arab League, the anchor of OPEC. If something needed to be decided in the Middle East, Riyadh was where people came to decide it. But something remarkable happened in the last 30 years. A small federation of city-states sitting just to Saudi Arabia's southeast, a country so young it did not exist until 1971, quietly, brilliantly, and relentlessly built. Something that Saudi Arabia could not match. Not with all its oil, not with all its religious authority, not with all its centuries of history. Dubai happened, and Dubai changed everything. While Riyadh was still heavily dependent on oil money and operating under some of the most conservative social rules in the world, Dubai was building the world's tallest skyscraper. It was creating the world's busiest international airport. It was turning itself into a playground for billionaires, a hub for traders, a home for expatriates from every corner of the planet. It attracted the regional headquarters of 70% of major multinational companies operating in the Middle East. It built a financial district modeled on London. It created free zones where foreign companies could own 100% of their businesses, something almost unheard of in the Arab world at the time. It hosted art fairs, fashion weeks, world expos, and international sporting events. The UAE did not beat Saudi Arabia by fighting it. It simply made itself the most useful place in the region for the world to do business. And for a long time, Saudi Arabia accepted this. Oil prices were high. The kingdom was comfortable. Let Dubai have its skyscrapers and its nightclubs. Riyadh was the real power. But then the world started changing. Oil demand began its long, slow plateau. Young Saudis, 60% of the country is under 30 years old, wanted jobs in technology, entertainment, and finance, not just in government ministries and petroleum companies. The kingdom's rulers looked at the math and realized that a country running on one commodity in a world transitioning away from that commodity was a country heading toward a cliff. By the time Saudi Arabia's young crown prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, looked at his own kingdom in the early 2010s, he saw a country dangerously dependent on oil in a world beginning to move away from oil. He saw a young population with enormous energy and nowhere to direct it. He saw a bureaucracy so heavy and slow it could take years to start a business. And he saw, just next door, this smaller, leaner, faster country that had already done exactly what he was dreaming of doing, and had done it 30 years ahead of him. So he launched Vision 2030, a plan to transform Saudi Arabia into a global hub for business, tourism, entertainment, technology, and logistics. A blueprint not just for economic diversification, but for national reinvention. He allowed women to drive. He opened cinemas. He hosted Bruno Mars concerts. He announced said mega projects with names that sounded like science fiction. Neom, a futuristic city in the desert. The Red Sea Project, a luxury island resort. Diriyah, a cultural district built on the ruins of the ancient capital. Billions of dollars poured into construction. The world's media ran story after story about Saudi Arabia's transformation. And from Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the UAE watched this transformation very carefully. Because what Vision 2030 was describing was not just the creation of a diversified Saudi economy, it was the creation of a rival to Dubai. A rival with a larger population, a larger landmass, a larger government budget, and a crown prince willing to use the full machinery of the Saudi state to win. That is where the real rivalry began. Because Saudi Arabia was not trying to become something new. Saudi Arabia was trying to become something the UAE already was. The moment Riyadh declared that mission, the war was on, even if no one named it that. Saudi Arabia moved fast and it moved hard. In 2021, it began applying higher tariffs to goods made in UAE free trade zones, the exact zones that had made the UAE a manufacturing and re-export powerhouse. Then, in 2024, it went further. Riyadh announced that only companies with their regional headquarters physically inside Saudi Arabia would be ELI, Gibble for government contracts. Within months, multinational after multinational began packing up their Dubai offices and moving to Riyadh. By October 2025, 675 major global companies had registered regional headquarters in the Saudi capital, up from 540 just 12 months earlier. In logistics, Saudi Arabia announced plans to become a top 10 global logistics hub, targeting over 300 million air passengers per year and 4.5 million tons of air cargo. It doubled the capacity of Jeddah's South Container Terminal in 2025, pushing it to 4 million shipping containers per year, a direct challenge to Dubai's Jebel Ali port, which moved 14.5 million containers in 2023 and has been the undisputed logistics king of the region for decades. But it was not just ports and headquarters. The rivalry spread into energy markets as well. Inside OPEC Plus, the cartel that Saudi Arabia essentially runs and uses to manage global oil prices, the UAE began pushing back with increasing force. Saudi Arabia's preferred strategy has always been coordinated production cuts, keeping oil supply tight to keep prices high. But the UAE had spent billions expanding its own oil production capacity, and it did not want those investments sitting idle because Riyadh wanted to cut output. The UAE began pushing for higher personal production quotas, essentially asking to produce more even while the group cut overall supply. In 2021, this erupted into an open dispute that briefly threatened to break OPEC Plus apart entirely. A resolution was found, but the underlying tension never disappeared. Abu Dhabi continued quietly building capacity. Riyadh continued quietly, resenting it. And a cartel that depends on trust between its members started operating with a fracture running through its foundation. For the UAE, this was not just competition. This was an existential threat. Everything Dubai had built, its position as the place where the world came to do business in the Middle East, was now being systematically dismantled by a bigger, richer neighbor with its own government contracts as leverage. The UAE was not going to surrender quietly. Abu Dhabi doubled down on AI investments, renewable energy, and global logistics. It continued attracting tech companies, sovereign wealth deals, and financial institutions. It leveraged its already deep international relationships. But it also found itself facing a new corporate tax for the first time, introduced in June 2023, at precisely the moment when Saudi Arabia was offering companies zero corporate tax as an incentive to relocate. Both countries also turned global sports and culture into a battlefield. Saudi Arabia launched the Future Investment Initiative, a massive annual conference in Riyadh designed to sign all to the world that the kingdom was now open for business. The UAE countered with the World Investment Forum and the World Government Summit. Saudi Arabia bought Premier League football clubs, launched its own live golf tour, and bid for the 2034 World Cup. The UAE deepened its Formula One presence and continued expanding its already legendary airline, Emirates. Both countries poured billions into soft power, museums, cultural events, international sporting franchises, each trying to project the image of modernity and openness that would attract the next generation of global investment, and each watching the others spending with barely concealed intensity. This economic battle was cold and invisible to most of the world. What happened next was neither cold nor invisible. To understand why two Gulf nations ended up fighting each other through proxies across 5 countries at the same time, you need to understand something about geography that most people never learn in school. The Arabian Peninsula is surrounded by some of the most important waterways on the planet. To its east, the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes. To its southwest, the Bab al-Mandab, the narrow throat of water connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, through which massive amounts of global trade flow every single day on their way to and from the Suez Canal. These are not just important, they are irreplaceable. Whoever influences the lands on either side of these two choke points holds enormous power over the global economy. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE understood this, and both built their foreign policies around it. But they built those policies in very different ways. Saudi Arabia thinks in terms of states. It wants stable governments, recognized borders, and predictable order are, pound its neighborhood. It is a large country with long borders, long stretches of exposure, and instability on those borders terrifies Riyadh. A fractured Yemen on Saudi Arabia's southern border is an existential nightmare for the kingdom. A failed state in Sudan and across the Red Sea is a security threat. Riyadh wants order, even if that order is messy. The UAE thinks in terms of ports. Abu Dhabi does not need to control governments the way Saudi Arabia does. What it needs is access. Access to coastlines, harbors, trade routes, and logistics networks. It has built its entire foreign policy around securing that access, often by working with whoever actually controls the ground, whether that is a recognized government or a militia or a separatist movement. If a warlord controls a port, Abu Dhabi will talk to that warlord. These two philosophies, order versus access, looked compatible as long as the two countries are not operating in the same places. But when the Arab world began fracturing after 2011 and wars broke out in Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Sudan, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi suddenly found themselves operating in every single one of those same places at the same time, with opposite strategies, backing opposite sides. Yemen was where the collision became impossible to hide. In 2015, Saudi Arabia put together a coalition of Arab nations to fight the Houthi rebels in Yemen, an Iranian-backed group that had seized the capital and was threatening to turn Saudi Arabia's southern neighbor into a permanent Iranian base on the kingdom's doorstep. The UAE joined that coalition enthusiastically. While they were genuinely unified. Saudi Arabia wanted to restore Yemen's recognized government and stabilize the country. The UAE wanted to secure Yemen's southern coast and ports. But slowly, across years of grinding war, those goals began pulling in opposite directions. The UAE built, funded, trained, and equipped a force called the Southern Transitional Council, the STC. On paper, the STC was part of the anti-Houthi coalition. In practice, it was a separatist movement that wanted to split Yemen in two, creating an independent state in the south. For the UAE, this was strategically perfect. A friendly government controlling the southern Yemeni coast, the ports, and the trade routes, all without the complications of managing a unified Yemeni state. For Saudi Arabia, it was a nightmare. A divided Yemen meant permanent instability on its southern border, a power vacuum that could breed terrorism, and a direct challenge to the principle of recognized sovereignty that Riyadh had staked its entire Yemen policy on. Saudi Arabia pressured the UAE to rein in the STC. The UAE kept funding and arming it anyway. Year after year, the STC grew stronger. It took control of Aden, Yemen's second city. It spread into the eastern provinces of Hadramaut and Mahra, areas sitting on Yemen's most significant oil and gas reserves with long coas lines on the Arabian Sea and access to key export ports. By December 2025, the STC had effectively consolidated control over all of South Yemen. Saudi Arabia saw this as crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. On December 26, 2025, Saudi warplanes struck the port of Mukalla. Then they struck again in Hadramaut, then in Mahra. The target: UAE-linked arms shipments, UAE-backed positions, and the STC forces that Abu Dhabi had spent years building. Within days, Saudi Arabia dissolved the STC entirely and demanded that the UAE withdraw its forces from Yemen completely. The UAE, faced with its own positions under fire, announced a withdrawal. The coalition that had been fighting together for 10 years was over, not quietly retired, blown apart from the inside. But what made this moment even more dangerous was what it revealed about everywhere else these two countries were also fighting each other at the same time, because Yemen was just one theater. The rivalry by this point stretched from the Arabian Peninsula all the way down the Red Sea coast into Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, and the wider Horn of Africa, a crescent of competition running nearly 4,000 kilometers from Mukalla to Mogadishu. Sudan became the next most visible proof of how deep the split had gone. Sudan is strategically important in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. It has the longest coastline on the Red Sea of any African nation. It borders Egypt, Ethiopia, Chad, and Libya. It sits between the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. Whoever holds influence in Sudan holds a key that unlocks an enormous portion of Africa's geopolitics. When Sudan erupted into civil war in April 2023, a brutal conflict between the official Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces, known as the RSF, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE were immediately drawn in. And once again, they chose opposite sides. Saudi Arabia backed the Sudanese armed forces, the official army, the recognized government T, in line with its consistent preference for established state institutions. Riyadh hosted peace negotiations. It joined a U.S.-led mediation group. It framed its involvement in terms of regional stability and humanitarian concern. The UAE backed the RSF, the paramilitary force led by a man known as Hemedti, who had built his POW air base in the Darfur region and was accused by multiple governments and human rights organizations of widespread atrocities. Why would the UAE back such a force? Because the RSF controlled territory. It controlled routes. It controlled gold mines. And it was willing to give Abu Dhabi the kind of operational access that a formal government might not. The UAE repeatedly denied arming the RSF, but evidence mounted. Reports documented UAE arms shipments through multiple channels, including through Bosaso Port in Somalia's Puntland region, a UAE-linked logistics hub. In February 2026, Reuters reported that Et Hyopia was hosting a base where RSF fighters were being recruited and trained, with links pointing toward Emirati support networks. The human cost of this proxy war is almost incomprehensible. Sudan's conflict has killed an estimated 150,000 people. It has created the largest displacement crisis in the world. 12 million people forced from their homes. It has pushed regions of the country to the edge of famine. And at least part of the reason this war has kept going, according to multiple independent analysts, is because both sides keep receiving outside support. As political scientist Federico Donelli wrote plainly, as long as the UAE supports the RSF and Saudi Arabia support the SAF, there is no end in sight. It is a proxy war, and Sudan is paying for it with its own blood. The same pattern then appeared across the entire Horn of Africa, like a domino chain falling in slow motion. In Somalia, the UAE had spent years building relationships with regional administrations, especially in the semi-autonomous territories of Puntland and Somaliland, investing in ports, training local security forces, and securing access to the Gulf of Aden coast. When Somalia's federal government, backed by Saudi-aligned Egypt, pushed back against these arrangements and began demanding the UAE respect central government authority, Abu Dhabi's relationships with the breakaway regions became another pressure point. In early 2026, Israel formally recognized Somaliland as an independent state. Mogadishu saw the UAE's fingerprints behind the move, given the deep UAE-Israel ties that had grown since the 2020 Abraham Accords. Somalia severed its diplomatic relations with the UAE entirely, and it called for a Saudi military intervention in Somaliland, a direct ask for the other side in the Gulf rivalry to check Emirati influence. In Ethiopia, the situation was even more complex. The UAE had brokered the 2018 peace deal between Ethiopia and Eritrea, a genuine diplomatic achievement that earned Abu Dhabi enormous goodwill across the region. But Ethiopia's subsequent push to secure its own REDC access, landlocked since Eritrea separated in 1993 with over 90% of its trade flowing through Djibouti's ports at enormous annual cost, brought it into conflict with almost every coastal state in Tahi Horn. Ethiopia's ambitions toward Eritrea's poor Tea of Assab prompted both countries to mobilize forces along their shared border in 2025, and Ethiopia's construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Nile, which it declared fully operational in September 2025, reignited Egypt's deep fears about water security. Egypt, already closely aligned with Saudi Arabia, began expanding its military and diplomatic presence across the Horn, deploying troops to Somalia, deepening ties with Eritrea and Djibouti, and positioning itself as a counterweight to Ethiopian ambitions. The UAE sat broadly in the Ethiopian camp. Saudi Arabia sat in the Egyptian camp. The entire Horn of Africa was reorganizing itself around the line between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. By February 2026, this had become so visible that it overshadowed the African Union's annual summit in Addis Ababa, one of the most important diplomatic gatherings on the continent. 9 separate diplomats and experts told journalists that the Saudi-UAE feud was the invisible hand, reshaping nearly every major regional relationship in East Africa. As one EU diplomat put it bluntly, the Horn of Africa was being broken into pieces by foreign rivalries, and the Saudi and Emirati rivalry was the deepest fault line of all. And then there was the question of Israel, which added another dimension that neither Saudi Arabia nor the UAE would fully discuss in public. The UAE normalized relations with Israel in August 2020 as part of the Abraham Accords, a historic shift brokered by the United States. It was a bold move that gave Abu Dhabi enormous strategic and commercial benefits: direct flights, trade agreements, technology partnerships, and a special relationship with one of the region's most militarily and technologically capable states. It also gave the UAE enormous leverage and prestige on the world stage, domestically and internationally. They're not admitting to massacring their own citizens. They're claiming they defended the nation against a foreign-backed coup attempt. And they're using this framing to justify both the crackdown and their defiant stance against American pressure. The timing of Khamenei's speech was also significant. He spoke during the commemoration of Ayatollah Khomeini's return from exile in 1979, the event that triggered the Islamic Revolution and overthrew the American-backed Shah. The symbolism was clear. Just as Iran resisted American influence then, they will resist it now. Khamenei specifically accused the United States of wanting to seize Iran's vast oil and natural gas resources, saying America wants to devour Iran just as they controlled it before the revolution. But while Khamenei was issuing threats, Iran was also making shows of military force. On Sunday and Monday, Iranian forces conducted live-fire drills in the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 1/5 of the world's traded oil passes. This wasn't subtle. It was a direct message. If conflict comes, Iran can strike at one of the world's most critical economic choke points. The U.S. Central Command issued warnings to Iran not to threaten American warships or disrupt commercial traffic, but the drills proceeded anyway, described a massive armada heading to Iran, ready to act with speed and violence if necessary. The next attack would be far worse than what they experienced in June. Yet simultaneously, both sides were signaling potential openness to negotiations. Trump stated that Iran was seriously talking to the U.S., that they were negotiating. Ali Larijani, the secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, wrote on social media that structural arrangements for negotiations were progressing, contradicting years of Khamenei's public insistence that Iran would never negotiate directly with the United States. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said Iran was ready for fair talks, but not under the shadow of threats, a seemingly impossible condition given the current circumstances. So what's really happening here? Are we on the brink of war or on the verge of negotiations? The answer appears to be both simultaneously. This is brinkmanship at its most dangerous. Both sides are demonstrating military capability and resolve while keeping diplomatic channels barely open. It's a game of chicken with enormously high stakes. According to reporting from multiple sources, the Trump administration has presented Iran with 3 core demands. First, Iran must end all uranium enrichment and dispose of its existing stockpiles, essentially dismantling any capability to develop nuclear weapons. Second, Iran must limit its ballistic missile program, the delivery systems that make Iranian military power a regional threat. Third, and perhaps most significant, Iran must cease all support for its network of proxy forces across the Middle East, including Lebanese Hezbollah, Palestinian Hamas, Yemen's Houthi rebels, and various militias in Iraq and Syria. For Iran to accept these demands would mean fundamentally abandoning the strategic posture they have developed over 4 decades. The nuclear program, the missile arsenal, and the network of regional allies are the pillars of Iranian power and deterrence. They're how a relatively isolated nation of 85 million has been able to project influence across a region dominated by adversaries with far greater wealth and backing from global powers. Accepting Trump's demands would be tantamount to strategic surrender. Yet the alternative might be American military action that could be even more devastating than what Iran experienced in June. This is where the calculation becomes truly complex and truly dangerous. The Iranian regime just brutally suppressed the largest uprising since 1979. They've reasserted control through sheer force. Tens of thousands are in detention. The streets are quiet, though reports suggest some forms of resistance continue, with people dancing at funerals of massacre victims as acts of defiance. The regime knows it's vulnerable. The economic situation that sparked the protests hasn't improved. If anything, the international outrage over the massacre and new sanctions being imposed will make things worse. The Iranian people aren't going to suddenly forget what happened. The grievances that drove millions into the streets haven't been addressed. They've been suppressed. And suppression isn't the same as resolution. At the same time, the regime has demonstrated its willingness to use absolutely any level of force to maintain power. They've crossed lines that would have been unthinkable, even by the standards of previous crackdowns. They've shown they will kill thousands, tens of thousands if necessary, to survive. This creates a psychological dynamic where the regime might believe they have nothing left to lose. If they're already international pariahs, if they've already committed to whatever it takes to stay in power,